Thank you, Charlie. I'm often asked why I made the decision I did with regard to my Blackstone windfall. And there was a story that I read just about the time I was making the decision that might interest you. It had a big impact on me. It was a story about Joe Heller and Kurt Vonnegut at a hedge fund manager's mansion on the ocean in the Hamptons. And Vonnegut looks at Heller and says, "Joe, doesn't it bother you that this guy makes more money in a day than you made selling Catch-22 all over the world?" And Heller says, "No, because I've got something this guy doesn't have." So Vonnegut looks at him and says, "Joe, what in hell could you possibly have that this guy doesn't have?" And Heller said, "I know the meaning of enough." And it's one of those stories that kind of stuck with me. And I said, what the hell, I've got more than enough. So what else do I have to think about? Another factor was I've spent quite a few years on this subject, and the more I looked at the recent numbers on the future, the long-term future, the structural future, the more convinced I was by the total unsustainability of this long-term picture. And I was in a Nixon administration where we had a Nixon humorist, which may strike some of you as an oxymoron of sorts. But Herb Stein used to say, if something's unsustainable, it tends to stop. Or he said, if your horse dies, I suggest you dismount. Now, we keep behaving as though we can ride this horse more or less indefinitely. Something else that has nourished me, the foundation did an opinion study of all former secretaries of Treasury, OMB, Council of Economic Advisors, the Federal Reserve Board, and on and on. And one of the questions we asked them is, do you think our long-term outlook is sustainable or not? And depending on your answer, how strongly do you agree on that position? And one of my early jobs in my checkered career was in a market research firm in Chicago. We used to do a lot of surveys. I have never seen this in any survey that at least we ever did. 100% of the people that answered said, A, the situation is unsustainable, and B, that I strongly agree. Now, what I'd like to do is just mention two aspects of this unsustainability that perhaps do not get as much attention as they might, and might deserve higher priority perhaps, or at least they're highly relevant, it seems to me, to CED's investment of becoming an investment economy, becoming an innovation economy. Now, one of the things that happens in the longer-term future, as you perhaps know, is that interest costs balloon to unprecedented levels. The Congressional Budget Office estimates at what I consider rather benign interest rates that between now and 2040, the increase in interest costs would be 10% of the GDP, just the increase. Now, we speak often at the CED of investing more in R&D and infrastructure and so forth. How does this increase in interest costs compare with our current investment in R&D? Well, it's 10 times what the government spends on R&D, and it's about 4 times what our country invests in R&D. Now, these interest costs obviously buy us nothing and crowd out desperately needed investments, not just in R&D, but in critically needed infrastructure and other investment. Now, the other big elephant in the room that I'll just say a word about are entitlements. What do entitlements have to do with our investment agenda? Savings and investment obviously have to do with the future. Consumption has to do with the present, the here and now. Now, spending on us geezers, which is what the entitlements are all about, is basically about consumption. It has very little to do with the future or investment. Now, as to entitlements, what are the big elephants? And the biggest elephant by far, of course, is health care. Now, how big an elephant is it? If you look at America's unfunded promises and liabilities, they total for entitlements about $45 billion. But 38 of those are Medicare, and only 7 or 8 are Social Security. If you look at our health care costs, we spend about twice as much per capita as the rest of the world, and the outcomes, if anything, are a little less good. Again, if you look at the crowding out of our investment agenda, we spend 7% more of the GDP on health care than other countries do. Now, that's about twice, over twice, about what America spends on R&D. So we all have an economic state and the future growth and competitiveness of the U.S. economy and the investment agenda, but I'm simply making the argument that those of us at CED in business have to attack the brute question as if we are sincere in our belief in investment. Where and how do we get the resources to finance that investment? Now, I know of no better persons to answer these questions than our luncheon speakers, Peter Orszag and Fred Smith. I've been happy to introduce Peter. He's become a very good friend, and I've become an unambiguous admirer. His academic achievements are simply extraordinary. He's a summa cum laude from Princeton in economics and a PhD from the London School of Economics. His role as head of the Congressional Budget Office and head of OMB qualify him superbly to speak on our fiscal situation. But in particular, and less well known, Peter is truly one of the country's leading experts in health care. As if he needs any other qualifications, he was born with a giant brain. Indeed, one of America's best-known sages called him the brightest economist of his generation. So it's my special pleasure to introduce Peter Orszag.